Okay, good morning. Welcome to our Erev Shabbat Friday Perashat version of our class, Perashat Vayehi. Question this morning is, did or at what point did Yaakov Abinu take a detour in his attitude towards the future of Am Yisrael? You know, this parasha starts off in such an unusual way. Vayehi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim sheba esrei shana. Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim 17 years. Well, the term Vayehi is never used regarding the actual dwelling of a person. Exclusively, we see with the other forefathers and other characters in the book of Perashat and elsewhere, when you want to talk about someone has dwelled in the land and how long, you use terminologies of either Vayavod or Vayeshev. Compounded with another issue is that we know from last week's parasha, Paro asked Yaakov Abinu, how old are you? He says, I'm 130. We know that in the continuation of this very same first pasuk in our parasha, Vayehi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim v'arba'im u'ma'at shana, his total lifetime was 147 years. Well, we can do the math. 147 minus 130 is indeed 17. And therefore, it seems to be unusual. First, the Torah chooses the terminology of Vayehi Yaakov. Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years instead of telling us Vayavod, Vayeshev, he dwelled, he sojourned there, he settled there. And on top of that, more interestingly, is that we don't need this statistic at all. It seems completely superfluous. Well, you know, of course, that the only parasha in the Torah that's called Situmah, completely closed, is the parasha of Vayehi. And of course, we know what that means, that usually a next parasha in the Torah is either beginning in the scroll and the text on parchment of the Sefer Torah on the next line or on the same line with a space. Of course, Perashat Vayehi, anyone's a Baal Koreh or Misader who try to find the place on the column in the Sefer Torah is very difficult because there is no space at all, just a normal continuation of a sentence in a pasuk. And we know, of course, that Hachamim put forth some possible theories as to why that is, why the closure, what did that closure of two parashiot stand for? The famous one brought down by Rashi is that once Yaakov Abinu died, their eyes of Am Yisrael were closed, so to speak, because of the impending and beginning difficulties of exile. And therefore, their eyes, their lives were, so to speak, contracted and closed and in a greater position of difficulty. There is another well-known theory, and that is that we'll see soon that Yaakov tried to prophesy something later in the parasha. His prophecy was concealed from him. It was closed, so to speak. And there's a less known possibility put out by Hachamim in the Midrash, and that is that all these sarot, all the troubles and suffering in the world was nistam, was closed from Yaakov Abinu in Egypt. Now, the commentaries point out that not only is there a closure, but that closure creates a juxtaposition, a connection with the last pasuk of the previous parasha. Perashat Vayigash ended up talking about Bnei Israel's existence in Eretz Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen, Vayehazu ba, Vayefru vayirbu me'od. They clung on, they took advantage of, they engaged in society, and they multiplied, and they were very successful financially, and in all modes of life. And the fact that we have now a juxtaposition between two parashiot, we can find connections between that last pasuk, Am Yisrael's success, and the theories of why those two parashiot are closed. And that last pasuk helps us understand those theories. And if you just look at the last theory and that closure and the previous pasuk, I think it sheds light on this interesting beginning of Vayehi Yaakov. So the last theory again is that all the sarot, all the troubles of the world were closed to Yaakov, meaning they were ended. He had no more suffering. And the previous pasuk in Parashat Vayigash indeed tells us that Vayifru vayirbu me'ot, Am Yisrael saw sustenance and bounty and prestige and success. And there is the source of Yaakov Avinu's respite, of his final 17 years of life. And really based on that, there's a Midrash called Midrash Hagadol that actually tells us on that pasuk of Vayehi, he lived 17 years, which we know that already was superfluous again. The Midrash says, but in these years, they were years of soba and toba, they were satiation, shalom, serenity, peace, and goodness. As last week's parasha, he conveyed to Paro, I had 130 years, me'at v'ra'im. Really, I found difficulty and challenge and suffering in my life up till now. And these last 17 were what we would call life. Vayehi Yaakov. Yaakov lived out these last 17 years. In fact, perhaps the last 130 were even forgotten, so to speak, because of the joys of the previous 130, because of the joys of the final 17. And that's Vayehi. That is true life. That is a life where we pray, and there's a pasuk from Mishleh, Vayesifu lecha shenot hayim. There is life, and then there's living. There's life of years. There's life of true satiation. And that's what Yaakov Avinu experienced in these last 17 years. But more than that, we can compare another term in last week's parasha, and that is when Yaakov learned of and believed of the existence and the continued life of Yosef Avinu in Mitzrayim, Yosef HaSadik rather in Mitzrayim. It says, Vatehi ruach Yaakov abihem. And his spirit lived. And Hachamim tell us that during the 22 years that he was in mourning, or at least what he thought was mourning for Yosef, his beloved son, he lost his prophecy, because we're told that a prophet cannot prophesy through a mindset of depression. It has to be only in a state of happiness and elation. And therefore, he had no prophecy those 22 years. And besides the other implications of Vatehi Ruach Yaakov, that Yaakov's spirit became alive when he learned and believed of Yosef's existence, there is also the returning of his prophetic spirit. Vatehi Ruach, all of a sudden, Yaakov's prophecy came back again. He was able to connect to God in a prophetic manner. And he was able to share prophecy with others once again. That lived. That also is within this first word in our parasha, Vayehi Yaakov. Not just a life of physical blessing, but a spiritual life. You can say that Yaakov Avinu was exploding with spirituality, with prophecy, and a prophecy that he yearned to share with those around him, and almost to make up for past years, those 22 years of lost prophecy. And there he was, like a wellspring of intellectual insight, of depth, of scholarship, of relations with Hashem, and with pure prophecy. He was not only experiencing it on his own, it was resonating, and everyone around him felt this unbelievable resounding sensation of Yaakov's prophecy. He shared, he taught, he gave insight. And that really was the full picture of those last 17 years. Life, full life. Vayehi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. Those 17 years of makeup, not only of his difficulties, but of his spiritual, intellectual, and prophetic lackings during those previous 22 years. He lived it well, and he lived it to its fullest. And that then takes us to a possible pinnacle later in the parasha, well, this great explosion of prophecy of Yaakov Avinu, where he was going to take that to the nth degree. And that, of course, is the scene where Yaakov was prepared to, so to speak, bless his sons in the end of his life. And Hachamim tell us, as he asked his children to gather round, and let me tell you about Aharit Hayamim, the end of days, that analyzing some of the nuances of the Pesukim here, we understand that Yaakov was not able to, he was not successful in being able to convey those insights which he intended to his children, and not to communicate what he originally planned on. And therefore, based on that, the famous saying of Hachamim that we mentioned earlier, and that is that Bikesh Yaakov Abinu legelot banav et hakes v'nistemu memenu stam memenu nevuah. He attempted, his objective was to reveal to his children the end of days, and that was closed up, that was prevented, it was held back from him. Besides the obvious reasons of why it was held back, I think it behooves us to try to understand at that peak of his prophecy, in those last moments of his life, what insight did he really yearn to share, not just with his children at the time, but with us, with all his descendants of Am Yisrael to the distant future? What was Yaakov Abinu in the apex of his intellectual and scholarly connection to God trying to relate to us? And it's all about this term, Aharit Hayamim, the end of days. We see that term replete in the words of the prophets in the Nevi'im, in Yeshaya, in Yirmiyah, in Daniel. There's also mentionings in Micha of such a terminology. They're all futuristic. Some are the traditional idea that the future times of redemption and Mashiach. One alludes to the war of Gog and Magog, the great war of the future. Some terms of Aharit Hayamim, end of days, allude to the future retribution and punishment to our enemies. Some just general future, but all about some time in the distance where the destiny of Am Yisrael plays out. And truthfully, in this first introduction of this term to us, for the first time, the Torah, Aharit Hayamim, it's very possible that Yaakov Abinu wanted to reveal all of that to Am Yisrael. And in fact, we know that there's a famous term in Yeshaya the prophet, Be'ita Ahishena, that in its time, I will hasten it, speaking about the future redemptions. And Hachamim point out in the Gemara, that's an oxymoron. If it's in its time, it's in its time. It's a set calendar day of Mashiach. If it's going to be expedited, that's going to be earlier than its time. And of course, the Gemara reconciles that difficulty by saying, well, if Am Yisrael are practicing the will of God, it'll expedite. If not, Be'ita, it'll come at its time. And based on that, Rabbeinu Sa'adia Gaon in his great work in Emunot V'Dir'ot tells us that there are two ending times for Am Yisrael. We don't know how the story ends yet. One is called the Ches, the end, which is so to speak the forced ending, where redemption has to come at a certain point. It might be forced upon us. It might come in a violent context, which we don't want, or Teshuvah, as described in Perashat Nesabim, or when Am Yisrael repents, and Ahishena, we expedite and we hasten that redemption. Did Yaakov Abinu want to reveal what would be the form and shape? How would the future redemption look? Very possibly, I'll say very probably, that was within his desire to reveal to them. And in fact, if you look at the Targum of Yonatan ben Uziel and the Talmud Yerushalmi, they add on all different possible insights that are incorporated in that terminology of Aharit Hayamim, the end of days, including punishment to the evil, reward to the good. What does Gan Eden look like? What does the Hayat HaMetim look like? How does the real future and destiny of Am Yisrael seem in a physical and spiritual manner? When will it come? What will happen? Who, where, what, how? All of that explained and served to us on a silver platter by Yaakov Abinu in this final, most impactful, deep, insightful moment of his life, where those 17 years of exploding prophecy were about to find their climax. At this moment, and stop. But I want to tell you that if you read through these so-called berachot, you will see that there was certainly some prophecy. In fact, most of them speak about the future. I like to compare it to a dam, a giant wall that's holding back waters from going over and beyond it. But because the power and pressure of those waters are so great, it can only hold so much. And there are leaks in that dam. And there are springs that are oozing out of that dam. There's only so much that the prophecy of Yaakov Avinu at that point in his life could be held back. And so therefore, if you look through, besides the first three sons, Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, were primarily rebukes, the rest of the communications to the sons is what you can possibly categorize as near future prophecies. They weren't far distant prophecies, spoke of the way their tribe and the life of their tribe. But look, in the first Commonwealth, when they came to the land, the first Beit HaMikdash, they were all played out very accurately. The only one you can say that is maybe a longer term prophecy is with Yehuda. He alludes there to hintings to possible far future messianic times and times of redemption. Otherwise, it's very short-term prophecy, you can say. But then there's a point in time during these berachot, so to speak, where Yaakov Avinu digresses. It's with Dan. And he alludes to, as the commentators point out to us, this leader that will spring forth for the tribe of Dan. And we know from our Mefarshim, but it's hinting to Shimshon, the great Shofet, the leader of Am Yisrael, the mighty warrior Shimshon, and the way that he incredibly really was a one-man army, as they say. He was able to take on hundreds of Philistines on his own with ambushes. He's likened here to a snake on the road who bites the ankle of the horse and it comes falling backwards, how he had such a leveraged ability to conquer greater forces than his. And of course, the terrible tragic ending of his, where he took down that great structure and tens of thousands of Philistines with him in the end after they tortured him. And in that prediction of Yaakov Avinu, there suddenly is what seems to be an epiphany. As Yaakov stops and he says three words, Lishu'atecha kaviti Adonai. Your salvation, for your salvation, God, I hope, I yearn. He stopped in the middle of his blessings and all of a sudden prayed for something. It's astounding. It's as if Yaakov Avinu was hit with something all of a sudden. And I believe that he was hit with the following. He was on a track from the time he came to Egypt to be able to relay and convey and provide insights with no end to Am Yisrael, including all of future events. And he believed that was the way to go. That was the great gift he could offer his children and descendants. And that included the times of Mashiach and everything we need to know. And at a certain point, as he is having these short-term prophecies, you can say, these near future prophecies, he hits Shimshon and he sees this survivor and he sees this fighter, this brave person, and he looks and he's all about hope and he's all about possibilities and not giving up and yearning and trying and resiliency. And he realizes that the future generations are going to have a real, genuine struggle. And yet my children are going to use all their energies and never lose hope and always scratch and claw to final salvation and redemption. Gentlemen, this is the line, ladies and gentlemen, this is the line that we utter in our beracha, Na'amidah 3 times a day, in the Etzemach beracha, Ki lishu'atecha chivinu v'sepinu kol hayom. This is the line that Hachamim tell us after 120 will be asked as one of our questions. Did you yearn for redemption and Mashiach every day of your life? This is the line that Yaakov Avinu decided that maybe predictions and far distant insights are not the way to go. complacency will inevitably be the result of that. And rather, the way to go is do the right thing in every generation, wait it out, have faith, have hope, yearn for and pray, and know that it's around the corner at any time. And that's the way you'll make it happen. And in that moment of insight, Yaakov Abinu decided to join every single generation in the future of Judaism in that very same prayer. And he stopped speaking to his children. He turned to Kadosh Baruch Hu and he said, "Lishu'atecha kaviti Adonai." I too hope and yearn for your salvation and that great day, those great times of redemption and Mashiach and Tahayat HaMetim and everything great that comes with that package promised to Am Yisrael. And I believe right now at this moment that that's the way to go. Live every generation, not knowing how long it's going to take, but never lose faith. Continue yearning, continue looking towards and doing everything you can in your generation, living among Am Yisrael, to bring that redemption, to spur it, to expedite it, to make sure that it comes as soon as it possibly can come. And therefore, Yaakov Abinu, very possibly, through this experience of great prophecy, but this stoppage towards the end of his life, changed avenues and took a little bit of a detour and decided that maybe more is not better in this regard. And I will be among my nation, Am Yisrael, and I will hope and pray and yearn for the comings of final redemption. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.